Hi, everyone. I'm Saeed, and I am a professor in the creative nonfiction department in the MFA program. I know we're starting a little bit late, and I have a whole introduction that I was going to do for Marie Mutsuki Mockett, who we're so happy to have here tonight. I might trim this a bit because we're going to want to hear from her, and then we're going to see my students, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So just a little show and tell. Marie, forgive me, but this is semolina bread. And we're going to be talking tonight about American Harvest, Marie's new book. And I'm bringing out this bread because I scarcely ever give much consideration to where bread comes from, how it's made, how it got to me. I'm a creative nonfiction writer who's pretty much doing the opposite of what the creative nonfiction writer's mission is, which is to dig deeper into the commonplace, the familiar. As Brecht put it, it's the everyday, those things that on the surface seem to be too banal to have anything worth saying about them. And what Marie has done in her new book is to tell me where this bread comes from. American Harvest is a powerful book. It shook up what I thought I knew. It challenged me, it taught me. It's an exhaustive study of 7 heartland states, which Marie knows well. It's about bread, yes, and it's about agriculture, and it's about race, it's about religion, it's about wheat being harvested. This book is timeless, and it's specifically for our times. Marie has received many honors, and I cannot list them all here, but one of them is the NEA, and she is the author of the novel Picking Bones from Ash, which was shortlisted for the Soroyan International Prize for Writing. She's written the memoir Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye, which was a Barnes & Noble Discover pick and a finalist for the 2016 PEN Open Book Award, also Indie's Choice Best Book for Nonfiction and the Northern California Book Award for Creative Nonfiction. Her new work, American Harvest, God, Country, and Farming in the Heartland, is from Gray Wolf, and it was a finalist for the Lucas Prize and awarded by Columbia and Harvard University Schools of Journalism. Marie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for bringing a loaf of bread.
I'm going to eat it later.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. Am I reading now? Is that what I'm doing?
Yeah. Why don't you read for 5-6 minutes, whatever
Okay.
you'd like, and then we'll turn it over to our students. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to read just from a little bit from the beginning of chapter 2, which I think explains what the context of American Harvest is. It essentially it's a big road trip. Me on the road with a group of wheat harvesters who travel from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania to Texas every year in early May, which is when the wheat harvest begins in the United States. And then they travel as the wheat ripens all the way over to Idaho. And I had the very good fortune to go along with them. And so I will read to you so you get a taste of who's in the book and what it's about. And really all you need to know is that our main character is a 57-year-old man named Eric, who is a devout Christian from Pennsylvania. Eric's annual route always starts in Texas because that is where American wheat first ripens. The crew will follow the wheat belt north as it continues to mature. The wheat ripens at a rate of about 20 miles a day. Over the years, Eric has built up relationships with farmers who own land in each of the 7 states, and they all work on the assumption that he is coming to cut their crops. Each year, the arrangements are made on a handshake. There are no paper contracts. For harvest this year, Eric is traveling with Emily and Justin. His older son, Winston, usually accompanies him too, but his wife is expecting a new child and he will stay home in Pennsylvania with her. 2 other family members are with the harvest crew, Bradford and Bethany, who are brother and sister, are Eric's nephew and niece. Bradford is 22 and Bethany will turn 20 while on the road. The others are young men from the community back home. Competition to get into Eric's crew is fierce, and most of these boys will have called a year in advance for an interview and a chance to participate. Rain or shine, they will be paid a daily flat fee and will be fed, housed, and given a chance to see the United States. This year there is Luther, the oldest at 25, Michael, who is 22, Samuel, who is also 22, and Amos, who is 23. This is the first year that a woman has been part of the group. Bethany and I will share a trailer that Eric purchased. A few days before I arrive, Eric drove 1,400 miles with his crew from Lancaster, Pennsylvania to Hydro, Oklahoma, where a friend and fellow harvester, Dwayne, lives. The combines and trucks were all ferried on the backs of flatbeds hauled by semi-trucks. Eric dissuaded me from making this drive and asked me instead to fly to the Will Rogers World Airport in Oklahoma City, where I pick up a rental car, a small SUV that still feels larger than anything I'm used to. I drive it through a heavy rainstorm, and after it passes, I see a rainbow in my rearview mirror. Eric has given me directions. I thought that when I asked for a landmark, he would direct me to something like a McDonald's in town. But he does not choose a place whose logo juts obtrusively out of the land. His instructions imply a faith in my powers of observation. He has told me to look for a bridge where there's work being done, and that once I see the bridge, I will see 2 combines. Along the way, I pass signs for Halliburton, Hobby Lobby, and Trump Pence. And then I turn off the interstate, and there is the bridge with yellow tape, and there are the combines set up on trailers attached to 2 semi-trucks. The rigs are parked on a farmer's gravel lot by an unused barn. The rain has now completely passed, and the combines gleam in the sun, a glossy, confident red against the green and gold landscape. Each combine costs anywhere from about $250,000 to $350,000. With its hydraulic lift and changeable header, a combine is about as close to a transformer as you will find in the real world. Each one weighs nearly 30,000 pounds, which means it must be carefully placed on the back of a semi-truck to be hauled across the country. All the different pieces of harvesting equipment are a bit like pieces of a puzzle, with space at a premium to accommodate 3 combines, 4 headers, a tractor, 3 grain hoppers, and a grain cart, all of which must be loaded onto 4 semi-trucks. Eric has devised different ways to transport each configuration. One truck has a combine and a hopper behind it, and another has a combine and a hopper with 2 headers fitted inside. The header is the knife of the combine and the part that cuts the wheat. This particular hauling method requires the combine face forward, and when I arrive, Justin is wrapping the front windshield with a thick plastic sheet for protection. "One rock," Eric says, "and that glass shatters into a million pieces, and it's miserable cutting without a windshield." It is decided that Justin will drive me into the camp where the trailer houses are. This will happen a lot over the course of the spring and summer. The men will do the driving. There are practical reasons for how and why this happens. I often do not know where I am going, and the men do. Justin also jokes to me that I'm about 8 years old in farm years. The age is not chosen arbitrarily. 10 is about when kids start to drive tractors, and I cannot truly drive a tractor. Justin attends a Christian university in Pennsylvania where he is majoring in English. He is tall, good-looking, and a little bit brooding, with a fuzzy beard, mustache, and blonde hair of an indeterminate texture and length because he keeps it hidden under a Wheeler Brothers grain cap at almost all times. There is a hole in his ear where he wears an earring when he isn't on harvest, and we occasionally joke that his true identity is as a hipster. But this is merely a joke because he is no hipster. He's the son of a farmer who never went to college, which makes Justin a bridge between worlds. He likes language and the analysis of ideas in a way I find comforting and familiar, while his fellow farmers often tease him about college talk. Now we are driving onto Dwayne's property. A bonfire is burning slabs of wood and tree branches. That's how we get rid of trash in the country, Justin says. There are some men, boys really, working on a truck in the lot, and they stare as we park. They are slim and fit, and they all wear jeans and boots. They are a version of the boys I have seen year after year in Nebraska who come to cut our wheat. Justin has explained to them that I'm a writer. I hope you don't mind, he says, chuckling. I told them you were from San Francisco, and one of them asked, you mean like she's a Democrat? I'll stop there.
Thanks, Marie. That's great. I think my
Thanks.
students are going to now appear one by one, hopefully, if they're gonna, yes, here they all are. Hi, everyone.
They
Hey,
are.
before we start saying hi and introducing ourselves, I just want to say something. If anybody's going to put a question in the chat, if you could just note if you're a DLW or an MFA student, that would be great. So Marie, this is my creative nonfiction class, and can we do what we always do and just go around and introduce ourselves and say what it is we're working on for our MFA? Alexis, why don't we just start with you because you're at the top.
Sure. Hi, Marie. I'm Alexis. I'm working on a project about my father's family's immigration story from Hong Kong to Hawaii in the 60s, but I'm telling it in a fragmentary style. And there's not a lot of linearity necessarily, or, you know, full kind of narrative like we would normally expect from a memoir or something like that.
Great. Hi, Tori. Tori, you're muted.
Hello. Sorry about that. Nice to meet you. My name's Tori, and my project is a series of essays about late capitalism and the art market and what it means to make art in a time of great precarity that is possibly there.
Awesome.
Hey, why don't we just do this? Sarah, then Becca, and then Jadra.
Hi, I'm Sarah. My project is I'm working on a, I guess, talking about the last 6 years of my life post being held at gunpoint, dealing with a stalker and all the ramifications that come with mental health and PTSD and overprescription.
Hi, I'm Becca. I am writing a memoir about, I said I was from North Carolina earlier, but my grandparents were missionaries in Mexico, and then my parents were missionaries in Papua New Guinea. So I'm writing about just those 3 generations in my family and about missionaries and all of that stuff.
And I'm Jadra. I'm working on an interdisciplinary research-based project that kind of blends lyric essay and like prose poetry with also some more narrative memoir. And I'm also putting in like collages that I'm working on. And it's all about trash, literal and metaphorical. And it's all I think about.
All you think about is trash. So, you know, Marie, we've read the book, and I feel like there's a lot of things that you're doing in the book that we're wrestling with in class. I'm teaching the crafts class this semester. Last semester, I taught workshop. This semester, I'm teaching craft. And what we're doing in the craft is we're actually writing short stories. For a number of reasons, sort of figure out well, I don't want to speak for you guys, but it's like sort of giving ourselves distance from who we are, seeing ourselves as characters in a story. I'm gonna ask, why don't I ask the first question? Because you've written a novel and you've written nonfiction. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about sort of how those 2 genres differ for you or how they overlap. Were there challenges that one presented that another did not, or vice versa?
So when you say you're writing short stories, you're actually writing fiction. Is that right? And was anybody a fiction writer before this craft class? Oh, it's interesting. Sort of. So
But by the end of the semester, they're going to be all crack fiction writers, I promise.
I mean, it's a really, and you write both, don't you? I
Right,
seem to
yeah.
remember say they. Okay.
Yep.
So that's a really useful skill to be able to have. And before we were sort of hanging out, before we became wherever we are now, although everything looks the same, I was saying that I had not expected, when I was actually young, that I would ever write nonfiction. I just thought I would write fiction, and discovered nonfiction and discovered how wonderful the form is, and how I really feel like we're still figuring out all the things that we can do with it. So it's interesting to hear that people are working in different ways. And when I started working on American Harvest and knew that I wanted it to be my next project, I said to my editor at the time, I think I'm going to think of this as a novel. That's how I'm going to think of it. It's a story with characters in scene. We're moving through time. I'm going to stop occasionally and, talk about history or focus on something that I want to observe. But I basically had the novel in mind. There was so much I wanted to cover and so much I wanted to talk about, and the novel seemed like a good way to conceive of this project. But the nonfiction book that comes before is very different in form. Some people think it's very fragmented. I had a structure in mind when I wrote it. But the book that comes before deals with the aftermath of the Great East Earthquake and the tsunami and the nuclear catastrophe. And so a slightly more, I think, fragmented form worked for that, because it was basically a book about disaster and natural disaster and the implications on people. So I think of fiction as the thing that trains you to observe people, empathize with people, put people in scenes, move people around, allow the reader to see how someone is feeling, whether because you tell the reader what they're feeling or because you're able to describe very carefully what somebody looks like, what their gestures are. I think of all of that as coming from fiction. There was a period of time when I was reading published books for contests. And it was interesting because, without naming names, I would get these books that were written by writers whose primary training is in journalism. And there's a kind of a way that journalists write, where I usually speak of it as a camera, like the camera's here and the camera doesn't zoom in or zoom out or go in people's heads quite as much. Journalism is about a certain kind of, with good reason, a certain kind of objectivity and distance from the subject. And that's very important. The fiction writer, I think, or the creative nonfiction writer who gets a lot of their techniques and skills from fiction, is the one who thinks, I want to go in this person's head. I want to know what the termites are doing. I want to know how the anteater gets the termites, and then can really zoom in at a microscopic level, or pull out and suddenly decide, and now let's have a moment on Mars, and then come back down. And those are the thrilling things, I think, that come to us from fiction. And so this is not to say that, I'm successful in doing this, but that's how I think of the kind of the tools. If I were to reach down in the tool bag and pull out what I needed for a specific moment, that's sort of how I think of it, at any rate. If that at all answers your question.
I'm just going to thank you for helping to confirm some of the things that I've been thinking myself about it. So why don't I just open it up to the class here, and if you just want to go around, we might have questions about career, how this specific book came about, whatever, sky's the limit. Do you want me to call, or do you just want to do the organic thing, or Jadra's Lord of the Flies, where you call on someone? Okay, Sarah, sure, go ahead.
So I have a question. Since you wrote, obviously this book is about real people, real experiences, and the characters they exist in life. My question is, was your book well received by the people that you wrote about? Did they read what you had to say? And because it's difficult when you're writing about real people, and you're kind of tiptoeing around the truth, and you want to explain everything going on, but you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings or portray someone in a way that they wouldn't like. So how did you go about that, and how was your book received by the people in it?
So, I mean, I think the first thing I would say about this book is I thought of this, I took the position that this is not a book in which I describe my story. I mean, my story's in there. And I'll just tell you, I mean, this is an interesting craft question. After the first draft my editor read, he said, what I often hear, which is, there needs to be more of you in here, Marie. I thought I got to, you know, kind of stand back and describe the world. And he said, well, no, actually, we need more of you. But I mostly don't think of this book as about me. I think of it as me trying to understand what I'm seeing. So that's a slightly different position, right, than unearthing one's personal history. So I didn't see this as, even though, yes, there are moments where I'm unearthing my personal history. That wasn't the main goal. The main goal was for me to understand the world. And I can talk specifically what I mean about that. But that's a slightly different position and a slightly different lens. And it means that my way of interacting with people and with my environment is going to be a little bit different. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, you know, everybody knew in advance that I was on the road, not because I was any use as a farmer, but because I was taking notes and trying to write a book. And so everybody was clear from the beginning what was happening. And I was able to do this because Eric, who's the main character, felt very strongly about the project and was very open and shared a lot with me. So, and then within the characters in the book, a lot of them who perhaps come off as much more closed by the end of the book. I don't think they've read it. That's my understanding. I mean, it's a long book. I don't think they've read it. And I make it clear that I'm not in an environment where a lot of people read books, right? Eric and Justin love the book, are extremely supportive of it. And the interesting thing that has happened, well, there are many interesting things that have happened, but I get emails from people who are deep in the religious communities in America who've read the book and feel seen and want to talk about the experience of reading the book and want to have a conversation with me. And that's kind of cool and was unexpected. But it probably has to do because partly, I hope, because I was trying to say, I don't really understand what I'm seeing. Can I understand this any more deeply than what I've been told I'm seeing? And I think some readers respond to that, if that makes any sense. Other than that, you know, I just think it's really important to tell the truth when you're writing a story. I think sometimes in nonfiction we talk about intention. What is your intention in writing this piece? You probably hear that all the time. At least I do. And that's what I mean when I say, like, I would come back to the fact that I didn't understand. I mean, I didn't understand church. I didn't understand. I would go to church. I would have no idea what any of the priests or the pastors were saying, not priests, pastors were saying. I even had to learn the difference between a priest and a pastor because I didn't know. And I would say to myself, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to understand this world. But that's, you know, that's probably a little bit different than some nonfiction projects.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Marie, just one follow-up. What was your editor's rationale for saying he needed more of you?
There comes a point in the book where it was really clear to me that I couldn't wander around like Ian Fraser looking at the Great Plains, telling my American audience what I was seeing. Because everywhere I went, people would say, are you a Native American? And the Native Americans would say, are you a Native American? And that probably didn't happen to Ian Fraser. So my editor said, we need to make it clear from the beginning that you're not invisible, which was really hard for me because I haven't really wanted to write highly autobiographical stuff. So my editor said, well, when you went and got your nails done, didn't everybody in the Vietnamese nail salon see you and wonder what in the world you were doing there and where you came from? And I said, well, yeah, that did happen. So that was kind of the moment at which it had to be. And I think there's a movement in the book a sort of gradual understanding of what American history is, because these roads that we take, we start going from Texas up to Nebraska, following old, what we call the old cattle runs. And then the harvest route turns west and follows the old, the Transcontinental Railroad and the Oregon Trail. And so there are different pieces of American history that get uncovered. And then there's the whole, the movement of the American populations. And we end up in Idaho, we end up in a trailer on the Shoshone-Bannock Reservation, farming wheat that's owned by tribes, but farmed by the descendants of Mormon settlers, which is a super complicated piece of American history. And I originally thought, well, as the book goes along, the reader will learn more about the American history of this part of the country. And my editor said, well, no, I think we need to demonstrate that you start out with some clue as to what is happening. You can't just reveal everything as we go along. So you have to embed yourself as somebody who looks a certain way, is perceived a certain way, and has a certain degree of awareness, if that makes any sense. So those are some of the changes I had to make. And I think of that as having to do with, subtle adjustments in positioning, and again, in what the intention is. I originally thought, I don't care if people think I don't know anything. And my editor said, well, no, we can't do that.
Jadra.
So a lot of my favorite books come from Grey Wolf. It's just such a flex. Can you talk about, if you don't mind, like how you were able to get them to publish this great work?
I don't know, man. I'm so lucky. I love them. I know Ethan is amazing. Fiona's amazing. Well, so Grey Wolf published my first book, which was a novel. This was back in the days when I just thought I was going to write fiction. And that happened because they were the only ones who wanted to publish my novel. I think my understanding of this has changed over. I was thinking before this meeting, how am I going to talk about this? I think there were things about that novel that didn't conform to, I know there were things about that novel that didn't conform to what was expected from a novel written by a person who was writing from any sort of Asian American place. And Grey Wolf looked at the things that made that book different, and they loved those things. And it's taken me a while to sort of know how to look at that, or to understand that the things that make me quote unquote different are strengths. My second book came out from Norton. And then when I told my agent at the time, I want to write this farming book, everybody thought that was such a crazy idea. Everyone thought it was a really bad idea. They said, we had this book on the tsunami and you did all this interesting research in Japan. Maybe you could write another book about meditation, and I said, well, no, it was really hard to constantly go to Japan and learn all of these words for Buddhism in Japanese. I'd like to stick with the English language for a while and travel domestically. And so this was another project where I was doing something that I thought was really interesting, and that maybe the market looked at and thought was a little bit weird considering what I had done before, and Grey Wolf thought was cool. I mean, I remember talking to Ethan about it on the phone, and he said, that just sounds so interesting. That's so cool. Grey Wolf loves contradictions. And I said, well, there are these farmers and they're evangelical Christians, but they're worried about the divide and they don't want to vote for Trump, and they're worried the country is fractured. And this was pre-Trump being elected in 2016. And Eric was saying to me, I'm really worried, Marie. I think he's going to win. I think my people are going to screw up this election. I think you're wrong. I think the media's wrong. I think you don't know. And Grey Wolf thought all that was fascinating. But it goes against the narrative that we were being fed in 2016. And so I was having a really hard time selling it through a mainstream publisher. So all of that is to say that just seems to be where I've fit. kind of without, I mean, it without even, I don't want to say without even trying, but it just sort of has been a natural home for me. And they are as amazing as, you know, as you would think. I don't know if that answered your question, but you know, when I hang out with Ethan, we'll talk about books or people or ideas, and he feels so familiar to me, because in my family we always used to say, oh well, that's interesting, or oh well, that's just not very interesting. Oh well, I've heard that before. Well, that just doesn't sound like that's been thought through very well, or that's not an idea that's going to last. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that, you know, that we talk about. My husband just says I have ADD. He's gonna kill me. I can't believe I said that. Anyway. Alexis.
So you did a fun little interview with LitHub where they asked a bunch of authors different questions, but the one that I really liked was they kind of asked, I think, what your strength was. And you said it was unusual structure, but also that you wished you could write faster. So to that end, I'm curious how you determine structure, and then like what your writing process is for a very long project.
I thought it's interesting hearing about people who are working on these hybrid projects. I have twice now with nonfiction managed to find my structure through a visual image. The first, and I remember when I wrote Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye, which is the tsunami, we'll just call it the tsunami book. We sold it. I had written an op-ed for the New York Times. There's a whole story there. You know, I never thought I would have anything ever in the New York Times. And when people said write to the New York Times, I said, ha ha, right. Anyway, they published this thing. And then suddenly I was tasked with writing a proposal. And I had no idea what I was going to do, but I did have this idea that in Buddhism, there's this life cycle of the soul, where, you know, in the life cycle, there's like a very short period that's spent on earth, and the rest of the time their soul is on this recycling journey before they're reborn again. And at least in Buddhism in Japan, the people who are alive can intersect with this other world once a year, or during times when the boundary between the living and the dead is thin. Mediums can rescue spirits of the dead. All of the stuff is very relevant to the stories that we heard coming out of Japan during the tsunami. And I kept seeing this image, and I thought, well, I'll just structure a book around this image, and we'll start at the disaster where some people die and they start this recycling process, and some people die and they're supposed to start this recycling process, but they get stuck. We call them hungry ghosts, and then the living have to take care of them. Some people are in grief and can't move on. And then all of the places geographically that exist in Japan that facilitate healing or communication between the living and the dead suddenly made a lot more sense in the context of the tsunami. So I basically in my head traced that cycle. It's a pretty simple image. It's a circle. Sometimes I show it to students. It makes me look like I'm really nuts, but it worked for me. You know, I don't think this is in the book, but there are paintings where people draw pictures of children piling stones to build karma in order to be reborn. And then you can go to a place in Japan and see these stone towers where people actually build the stone towers. So that's how I found the structure, was off of that image. And I just kept returning to the image and then, you know, deviating as necessary. With American Harvest, this is a slightly tougher one. But I really thought a lot about how the Bible begins with the Garden of Eden, with what they call shalom in the book. And, you know, theologians will argue over what the word shalom means, because it means different things depending on what denomination you're in. But the world begins in a place of peace and brotherhood. And then the Bible ends with, or certain versions of the Bible, but certainly the one that's part of the Protestant church in America, ends with the book of Revelation. And I thought, well, what is that? What is that arc with that story? And I thought a lot about how the Bible is full of stories of brothers fighting. And, you know, it looks like we're finally getting somewhere, and then the next generation of brothers fight and kill each other. And So I sort of thought about that progression from a place of the Garden of Eden to the part where the world ends. And of course, one of the big conversations in American Harvest is the fact that the book of Revelation isn't really about absolutely everything being destroyed. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And it came to really deeply understand how much this notion that the end of the world is imminent is a part of a certain worldview that certain people in the United States have. And so, I naturally wondered, is there any way to subvert that point of view because it's destructive? And so I was definitely trying to trace that change. Hi, Rebecca.
Going off of that, obviously, like, so much of the tension in the book is between the city and the country, the divide, like you were talking about. And I think earlier on, I can't remember where in the book it was, you mentioned that it's easier to believe in God in the country because you're so dependent on acts of God, like weather, especially when you're farming and in this very agricultural role. So I was really curious, just and going back and forth between the two as you do, and being back in California now, do you notice that you have changed your opinions about things based on where you are? Or because that's something I'm interested in, is because you immerse yourself so much just in evangelical Christianity. When you're on this trip, you read so many books, you read the Bible. So obviously that was a big part of it too, but not even in terms of religion. I'm just curious, like, if you've noticed that your opinions have changed in just various ways writing the book.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in so many ways, and I'm not even sure it's fair for me to say. I have to be really careful because I remain unbaptized, and I don't want to misrepresent myself. But absolutely, it's more that the way that I see things has changed, and what I see, my understanding of history, the way that I think about what it means for us to live in a city has changed. I mean, I could give you so many examples. For example, my husband is from Scotland, and early on, he would say Scotland is the land that time forgot. And I had no idea what he was talking about because I'm from California, right? I grew up on the coast with people doing all kinds of interesting and innovative things, and not even thinking about history, or thinking that California is ahistorical, which is another subject. But I remember there were people in Scotland who was easy to talk to and people who it was harder for me to talk to. And my husband would say, well, they're modern, meaning I could talk to them. And I would think, well, what does that mean? What is a modern person? And this notion of modernity also enters into America, and it plagued me for a long time. And it's the concept of what is it to be modern also has followed me, honestly, from childhood, when my mother would take me to Japan, to really rural parts of Japan, where and this is a big one, there was no flushable toilet for a long time. And so that was not a modern place. And so I think, and there's a degree to which that is part of American Harvest. You have the people who are in the country, who could read the weather, who are maybe educated up to 8th grade, and who are really good with machinery in a way that I could never be, but maybe aren't modern. And if they're not modern, what is that? How do I describe that? How do I define that? I mean, I think that's something, and to the degree that I'm able to portray that, it comes from having spent a lot of time with evangelical Christians. But also my view of history has broadened and changed. I mean, I was in a cathedral, I think in Gloucester, at the end of 2019, and I suddenly thought, oh, this church was here before the Protestant Reformation. Were any of the windows or the idols destroyed? It would never have occurred to me to ask that question. And if not, why not? I was in Switzerland and I did this, I tried to write about this. I did a virtual Protestant Reformation VR experience. It was so bizarre. I had to do it. It was all in German. And I don't really know what the full intention of it was, but you had to go through and do things like destroy the icons in the church. And so then when I would go into a real church somewhere in Switzerland, I would see like the head of Mary in a little glass case from after Mary had been decapitated. And I would like have the memory of having destroyed the icons in the church, but it like meant something to me. And then I had to like turn the wheel to pretend like I was making a new Bible in the virtual reality Protestant Reformation. And when I was in high school and I learned about the Protestant Reformation in California, I learned that it was the way that literacy was spread throughout the world. Well, that was part of it, but it was partly people saying, no, if there's such a thing as God, I should be able to read the Bible in my own language myself without a priest intervening. And this is still like a fight that people have today. What is God? How do I know God? And why do I need a priest? And so I think like the intensity of that, and how personal that is something that I've come to understand more deeply. Anyway, I could go on and on. In terms of simple things like, is God real? You know, I have an answer. Is religion stupid? I have an answer. No, I don't think that I can weigh in. But some of these other questions, I think, and like understanding more of how our culture has been shaped by religion. And I would also say, and I'll stop talking, but I think understanding very early on, I was told by a friend of mine who is Black, he said, be careful. We think of the evangelical church as being the white church, and nobody studies the Black church. And the Black evangelical church is tremendously important to American history and to the development and the progression of civil rights. And there's just an article, I think, that came out in the New York Times, a review of the Black church, which talks about the importance of the Black church in the civil rights movement, and is an important piece of what Christianity is in America. And so I think my understanding of that also changed, and so I feel forever impacted by having had this experience that to me was totally out of my element.
Yeah, thank you.
Marie, I'm going to take a few questions from our from the people who are invisible. We're going to make some of them visible now. Actually, this first one, I'm just going to read it verbatim. It's from Tom Slay, who is, he teaches poetry in our MFA program here. So he says, hi, Marie. I'm Tom Slay, and I teach in the poetry part of the program. Gray Wolf is our shared publisher. This isn't a craft question, but gossip. All my people are dryland wheat farmers in Western Kansas, and I grew up driving a tractor. Umbrella, no cab, naturally no AC, water jug wrapped in burlap for my grandfather. It's a shot in the dark, but did you ever meet a family of custom cutters named Davy who are based in Texas? Rex was the father in my day, but it's been passed on to younger members of the family. And then he says, regardless, I'm delighted to have you here. Quick question, can you talk about the economics of wheat harvesting? And then he says, that is if you feel like it. And please feel free to ignore this question. Tom is super polite. He's the nicest guy in the 100. Do you know the Davies?
I do not know the Davies, okay. But I'm going to ask Eric if he knows Davies, right. Because Eric does know everyone, and then I can pass the answer back.
Do you want to respond to the economics of wheat harvesting?
The economics are terrible. The economics are hard. I mean, there were a couple I had a couple of blessings with this book, and that is that I was not writing about corn, which is a little bit more of a complicated crop than wheat. Like there's no real GMO wheat, so I didn't have to wade too heavily into genetically modified wheat because it's not on the market. The economics are terrible. It's really hard to make money. People operate on really thin margins. They go out of business all the time, but land is still really expensive, and it's very difficult to turn a profit, and partly because food in our country, believe it or not, is fairly inexpensive.
Hey, Marie, so Tom, listen, it's a fascinating book, Tom. And I found the economics of it really, really compelling because, as I said in the introduction, I never think about any of this stuff. I just see the bread on the shelf and I take it. But you really are very meticulous about everything that goes into it, the machinery, how stuff gets weighed, the weather, all of these things that are just, like you're saying at the beginning, it's the hand of God. And so many things are dependent on. I have another question for you. It's about how was it incorporating the science and your research? Was your editor weighing in about where and when you needed some more research, or you put in too much?
The one time he did was, as I was writing this, the Monsanto lawsuits were going on in San Francisco, and he wanted me to make sure that I gave voice to that. Depending on who you talk to, there are people who will say that Roundup is not harmful to humans, and he said we really need to make sure that you say even though I thought I had made it clear, he wanted it made very, very clear that if you expose yourself to glyphosate, that it is potentially incredibly harmful. So that was the one place, but not so much. No. We have these conversations in the we had these conversations so much in the family that I kind of knew where the parameters were. And there was so much more that I couldn't include just because the book was long enough. But it's very interesting to watch. I mean, for example, I remember Eric took me past this shed where I guess one of the first cloned milking cows was being put to use. And I remember saying, so how did they talk about it in church? And why would you want a cloned cow? And he said, well, if she's a good milker, you're going to want to clone the cow, which I'd never thought of that before. And they had made this decision that the cow you could have a cloned cow that was a good milker to produce more milk, and that this was something that had been talked about theologically too. So it's interesting.
Did you, just on a craft level, and by the way, this has been coming up in our class, and Tori has been, I think, stating it in a very succinct way. It's something she's wrestling with, but I think it's something every writer wrestles with, which is the fear of being boring, how to convey information, how long can you go conveying information before the reader gets bored. And you do have passages where you get into the science and you get into the history. And was that something that you were wrestling with in the book?
Oh, absolutely, of course. I worried
about
about
then tell Tori the answer. How do you solve it? And then tell me too.
I think if it's interesting to you, then, and if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I really hope this isn't boring, but I hope this isn't boring, I just have to add this fact. Oh, it's boring, but if it's like, this machine costs so much money and it's like a transformer, and if it's alive for you and you're describing something in a way that conveys your interest and excitement in it, then it'll probably come through the page. There's probably a little more history in this than Ethan would have wanted. And there are things like I had extra hunting scenes, and he said 1 pig hunt, Marie, and so the other pig hunt was cut. And I said, put in the other pig hunt. The pig hunt is great, by the way. The pig hunt is great. Well, you're supposed to leave them wanting more, right? So that's right. And just 1 pig hunt. You didn't get the other pig, and I can't remember now why I was so attached to the other pig hunt. But also there was some history in Oklahoma that I really wanted to include, and we went back and forth on how much got included. And I really felt personally, this is a personal thing. I didn't know how I felt when I read these letters that I found online of I think he's Ochre Hater. He's the Native American who gets taken to Florida and then comes back and is an Episcopalian priest, and there's stained glass window to him in the church in Oklahoma City. And we have in his beautiful handwriting, the first letters that he wrote in English online. And it really, it just moved me and affected me and upset me and alarmed me in so many ways, because I could hear my grandfather, who suddenly trying to write in English to the Americans after the war ended. So all that was really interesting to me. And I don't know that I actually really needed it, but it was important to me. So, I really believe in using your ear, and I really think that other forms of art are useful for us as writers. And I told you that I've used visual images to think of structures that work. I also spent a lot of time listening to music when I lived in New York, which I miss desperately. I used to go hear live jazz a lot, and I would hear how these musicians would structure their sets. They would it's an opener. Oh, now we're going to slow it down. Now we got to bring it back up again. Musicians are wonderful at teaching you pacing and timing, and how long you can sustain something before you have to switch direction. And I feel like all of that translates beautifully into writing, and the more sensitive you are to it, the more it can affect the execution of your own work. So those are just some things that I think about. But I think when trying to convey information, complex information, you also have to allow yourself to write a really crappy draft, right? And then read it and think, man, that is stiff. So if I were to I've got all my facts in a row. Now I'm going to tell the story as I would be telling a friend, in a way to entertain them, right? I now know how the combine works. I've got all the parts figured out. Now I have to suddenly tell the story to my friend in a way that's interesting. Like, I've processed all the information, I've crunched the numbers, I have everything organized. Now I'm going to roll it out as a story.
Marie, we've got another question here. It says, "Hi, Marie, can you talk about how you came to submit your essay about the tsunami to the New York Times? Specifically, I'm curious about how this essay led to you writing a book proposal."
It was a really good friend of mine, the writer Maud Newton, who kept calling and saying, "Is your family okay after the tsunami?" And I kept saying, "I'm completely in shock." And I would tell her a couple things like, "My family is near the nuclear reactor," or "My mom and I always went to the hot springs and right on the coastline. I just went on their website and there's no update." And she said, you should write an essay. And so finally, because she just kept saying, write an essay, I did. And then sent it into the New York Times via the slush pile, where probably nobody would ever have found it. But I told my agent, and she at the time said, "Oh, no one's gonna want your essay." But she read it, and she then found somebody at the New York Times to read it, and they ran it. And it did change the trajectory of my writing life. And then I knew as soon as that happened, I was going to have to come up with a proposal. And I'll just tell you, Richard, I think my proposal was terrible. I really didn't know what I was doing. I find proposals very difficult. But I had written another essay, which this agent also had kind of pulled out of me, on a crematorium in Japan, which was high tech and amazing. And the editor at Norton, who published my second book, knew that essay. So she knew my work already. And so, the more you can write and publish well, if possible, things are always happening behind the scenes, I think, that you don't know are happening. Do you agree, Saeed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes,
you can
absolutely.
be surprised.
You don't know, even when you're getting rejected, it still means that somebody has looked at it, and you don't know if that was someone really wanted it and it just wasn't going to fit in whatever publication that was, or one person didn't want it, but two people did, and they had to be, and you don't know if somebody from there is going to go to a different publication. You have no idea. None of us have any idea.
It's really true. I had an experience very recently where a piece that I sent to an editor at a journal, that editor said, "Oh, I know your work." A very well-known editor, who a book editor, had sent him my work, and I knew nothing. I didn't know any of this was going on.
Right.
So
You said though, when you sent, you know what, I hate to say, we only have like a minute, but when you said you sent in the essay to the Times, you said that your trajectory changed.
yeah.
What was specifically happening when when
Well, I mean, I had a small novel that had come out, and then the New York Times published my op-ed, and then I was on PR. Glamour asked me to write a piece. The National Geographic asked me to write a piece. I think I published a piece in Salon. I put together the proposal, and then I won the Japan NEA fellowship, which I'm sure is partly a result of the other. And here's to not knowing that things are going on behind the scenes. The New York Times ran the op-ed, and then people in Japan read it, and there was a guy, a Japanese journalist whose name I can't remember right now, but he wrote in Japanese that op-ed was the only op-ed in English to convey what Japanese people were feeling. And then a film crew in Japan read it. And so then when I was in Japan, the film crew contacted me and said, you know that you're in this book in Japanese, and would you like to be in this documentary? So all of that was, so that it's all just amazing. And then they knew so much about the film crew knew so much about Japan that I didn't know, that then made its way into the second book.
and that's based on the prominence of the New York Times.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I can't take credit for this, but all the students here took a craft class last semester with Michael Denzel Smith, where, right, you guys were practicing working on New York Times op-eds now? Okay, good. I'm glad I got that right. Listen, Marie, we've got to end.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm also glad that your cat made an appearance behind you, so you get extra points for that. Thank you to all my.
I banished her.
Oh, really? That you can't banish a cat. Cats get in anyway. It's been great talking and meeting you and reading your work. It's a real tremendous. Here, let me just. So if we were in person, Marie could sign the book for you, but you can buy it at your bookstore or Amazon. And all right. So to my students, I will see you all next Thursday. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.